Hello and welcome to the Upon Further Review podcast brought to you by Field Street Baptist Church. On this podcast, your host Cody Kitchen sits across the table from Dr. John Hall as he reviews his Sunday sermon from the week before.
Welcome to Upon Further Review podcast. I am your host, Cody Kitchen, and joined with me, as always, is the Dr. John Hall.
Oh, goodness. Welcome, everyone.
Sorry, too much emphasis on the doctor.
Probably.
Well, we are continuing in our series in Luke, going verse by verse, and we are in Luke chapter 14, verse 25 through 35, with the title of the sermon, A Sermon Which Repelled the People. So, John, as you prepared this message, what are some things that came to mind?
Two things, actually three. First, when I looked at that text initially, I was struck by the refrain, "You cannot be my disciple." And that was a shock to my sensibilities. And it compelled me to want to look at that more closely. And then also to make certain when I preached that text to the church, to make certain that I was intentional about putting that refrain in front of the people. Because I think Jesus was wise and clever in the way he used that statement, "You cannot be my disciple." And then the other thing, third, was, so at first it was the refrain and then the shock to my sensibilities. And then the third element that I thought of right away was just how demanding it is to follow Christ seriously as a disciple. And that we all would probably prefer to embrace being a fan versus being a follower, and they're light years apart. So that's what initially struck me. We're in some very tough texts, and it's not going to let up for a while. But the good news is next week we're in chapter 15.
Hey,
So we're making progress, yeah. Almost there. Only 24 chapters. We're in 15. We're on our way, man.
It's good. Hey, and if you were there Sunday or listened to it after the fact and that sermon did not affect you, believer or not, then you need to go listen to it again, because I don't know. It was a really good sermon, and that passage is very powerful, and so I hope it spoke to everybody as they listened, and if not, you probably weren't paying attention. But that's just my opinion.
Right.
So you opened up your sermon with an illustration about the Alamo, which I thought this illustration fit perfectly with the decision that we have each to be disciples of Christ. And you paired that in perfectly from the beginning to the end. And just like the men had to count the cost at the Alamo, you told us Sunday that we were told to count the cost with Jesus. And your first point of emphasis was the supreme affection of your life must be reserved for Jesus. And we see this in verse 26. And you start off by telling us that the hatred that Jesus is speaking is more of a lesser love. This is Jesus calling his disciples to a supreme devotion to him. This devotion, as you stated, should be so great that everything else would seem like hatred in comparison, even our own life. That's intense. And for me, I remember as I heard that, even almost taking my breath away of, man, what does that mean to hate my own life? Like, I think at first hearing that could be shocking. And so you go on to explain what a disciple is, which is a learner, a student, and a follower. And so this should make us all question where our devotion is. And I think that was the point of, as you stated Sunday, of what Jesus was getting at. And so my question is, could you go deeper on what verse 26 means for you and I today, and using the term, even as you said, of a lesser love? What does that mean?
Right. That's a good question. And perhaps the most helpful way to frame it for myself first and then for others listening is to pose the question to my own heart, do I love Jesus more than anyone and anything? Do I love Jesus more than my mother and father? Do I love Jesus more than my siblings? Do I love Jesus more than my wife? Do I love Jesus more than my children? And then, do I love Jesus more than I love myself? And as I think about it for me, I think, well, I think I love Jesus more than myself, but my children, my wife of almost 32 years. So I think what Jesus is demanding, if we're going to follow him as a disciple, he has to be the supreme affection of our lives. Has to be. He will not settle for second. And I think it's interesting, and I didn't bring this out enough or at all really in the sermon, but you could maybe land a little harder on the pronoun my. You cannot be my disciple. You might be someone else's disciple, but not my disciple. All of the aforementioned relationships have to have a lesser love quality. I have to be, Jesus has to be the supreme affection of your heart. All other relationships must be lesser in value and priority. And so when I think about it, it's a showstopper. I mean, it's a wowzer to me because I know how much I love my family. Yeah. And I believe in my heart God gave me this family to love. And for me to be derelict in my responsibility to love them and shepherd them would be disobedient to God's will and direction and gift of them in my life. But it's crystal clear in what Jesus said, they cannot come before him. I can't love them more than I love Christ. So I think we all have to take a real close look because we all have relationships in our lives that are so important to us, so valuable to us, that have impacted us so significantly that when we hear these words of Christ, we take a step back and we have to ask, am I the Lord's disciple? Do I love someone else, anything else more than I love him? And all of us aren't going to like the answers to those questions. I think that's what made the text so, just kind of keep you on the edge of your seat and the tension it creates between what is reality in your life versus what Jesus is calling you to. And the fact that he keeps saying, if you don't love me more than you love all those other relationships, you cannot be my disciple.
It's good. It's hard. It's
it
hard
is.
to hear.
It is. It's excruciating, and I'd be lying if I said I'm there. I'm with his help working on that. I love my wife. I love my kids. I love my children, and most people know our story, how we got our children, and it only intensified my love for them even more. Not that biological children are less loved. They're not.
Right.
But when I love hard. So this text worked me over good. So I was glad to share the misery with the church.
Well, you definitely shared the misery.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. And we even talked about, and not just to add this, but we even talked about separate from this podcast on the other day that, other places in Scripture we see that Jesus commands us to love our wives, to treat them. And so and there's by no means this is contradicting. That's not what I'm saying. But it's also at that point of, man, at least for me when I heard it, is what's that level of I love my wife and my family as well. And at what point do I, obviously that proves, okay, we don't hate them literally. But at the same time of, man, what's that level of leading my wife, loving her, doing as I'm told, as well as finding that way of, okay, I'm supposed to put Jesus first. And I think we put Jesus first by loving our wives. I think that's a part of it. But it's just interesting and almost hard to put your head around.
Yeah, I mean, the real irony is that the more we love Christ, I think the more we love our wives and children and friends and people we really care about. I'm a better husband because I love Jesus. I'm a better father because I love Christ. So, but when Jesus says on the front end of all this, you need to count the cost and you need to understand if you're going to follow me as a disciple, you want to be my disciple, I have to have the supreme affection of your heart.
Yeah.
And then that he lays it all out in the relationship categories. He leaves no stone unturned.
No, he doesn't.
Yeah.
As you say, he's a genius.
He is a genius.
And he knows what he's doing for sure.
No doubt.
So this is a perfect segue to your second point of emphasis, which was you must bear your own cross in verse 27. And I didn't know, I thought it was very interesting that cross-bearing was not an established Jewish metaphor in the ancient world. And you say that to take up one's cross demonstrates publicly one's submission or obedience to the authority against which one had rebelled. And you then say, if we are to follow after Christ, we will have to take up our crosses as well. And you say these powerful words, and I think it's worth quoting you. You say, taking up your cross and following him means to identify with him daily, to obey the revealed will of God and his word, and accept the consequences of a life yielded to him without reservation for Jesus' sake and the sake of the gospel. What a powerful statement. And another statement that makes you really think. So my question as I was preparing this podcast that came to mind is what could be the consequences of a life yielded to Jesus?
Yeah, I like the question, and I think the answer is going to be different for every individual. Your path and my path may cross and have similarities, but God has a path for you, has a path for me, if you want to frame it that way. So what it might mean for me is going to be different than what it might mean for someone who is a believer in a very hostile setting. But I think, too, maybe there are some commonalities for all real followers of Jesus who aspire to that with God's help and grace, like sacrifice, I think, right away, of redefinition. My life has not turned out like I thought it would. My idea of what I thought I would be doing as a pastor, where I thought I might be as a pastor, that went out the window years ago. A redefinition by the sovereign hand of God, the providential hand of God. I think it means for all of us a surrender, a yielding, that I think more of that comes the longer we walk with Christ. We are less willful and resistant. I think, too, this sense of having new priorities, those are some consequences of a life that's yielded to Christ. And then some of the more challenging aspects, being misunderstood, being misinterpreted, being ridiculed, and for some, many, in fact, in other parts of the world, being persecuted, families being persecuted, being put in prison, being tortured, some who've paid with their very lives for their yielding to Christ. We're a little, at the moment at least, somewhat insulated from that kind of persecution here in the United States, but we all might be a bit naive if we think it couldn't come here. So I think all of us have to kind of grapple with what the consequences are. What does it mean for me to yield to Christ, and what consequences may come into my life as a result of that, both positive and maybe less positive, but and still for some other Christians, some of the consequences of following Christ may be missed opportunities, missed job opportunities, you don't get a nod because, well, that man's he's a believer. He goes to church. Yeah. So I think those are some of the consequences, but again, it's so individualized. I think it's interesting that all the disciples died as martyrs. I don't know that your calling is going to be, or mine, is going to be a call to martyrdom. I don't know that. That's only known to God, but I don't know that, I don't really know any friends that I went to college with or seminary with that have died as martyrs. Now, sometimes we feel like that in the local church, but it's not, martyrdom in the truest sense. So consequences are going to vary and look different for individuals, I think. I mean, I could be wrong about that, but that's my sense of it at least, that it's going to vary. Your consequences you will experience have been very different from my consequences of a life yielded to Christ. But as I said Sunday, whatever sacrifices you are called upon to make, whatever difficulties come into your life as a result of following Christ as a disciple, it's worth it. It's worth it.
Yeah, as it should be.
Yes.
I hope I can say this without getting in trouble. So no, I won't get in trouble. But you've said the story before, and I don't remember where you've said it, but I remember it. And but I remember you talking about your father-in-law and how when he became a Christian and how he, looking back of getting passed up possibly because of his faith. And I don't know why I thought of that, but that was what came to mind is, I think a lot of us have that in some sense, maybe not like him, but there's some, it just made me think of that story where he got passed up and it was because of his faith and he wasn't going to yield. He wasn't going to just conform to it.
Yeah, when he experienced the new birth, he was radically changed. His priorities, his habits, and he gave up fraternizing with his superior officers, which probably cost him a promotion. This is a man who was Aviator of the Year in the Marine Corps, flew the F-4, landed on aircraft carriers, very skilled pilot, and a good man to boot. And we think, and he may agree to this, that looking back on all that, he saw the providence and the hand of God in his life, redirecting his life. Like I just mentioned here, it may be the consequence of redirection. I don't know that he intended to wrap up his military career, but he got to year 20 and got passed over, I'm sure for reasons that seem bizarre at the time, but looking back on it, he saw the hand of God and went into ministry, and he's been a faithful disciple of Jesus. Much to admire about my father-in-law.
Absolutely. Sorry, that's just what came to my mind.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned
it. Was a good
thank you.
Example. And this leads to perfectly in verse 28 through 33 of the third point of emphasis, which was you count the cost. And you tell us that there's a cost to following Jesus, and we must make an assessment. And I just appreciated that you honed in on the fact that there is a cost, that it's not this free ticket that we get and get to enjoy, but there's a cost to following Jesus. And you point out that Jesus provides us with some examples, and you say that what Jesus is speaking of here speaks of something far more than mere abandonment of one's material possessions. This is surrender. This is yielding to Christ, the bowing the knee to King Jesus. So can you expound more on these powerful words and how this solidifies the importance of Jesus' ministry?
I think Jesus is quite clever that on the front end, at the first, he calls those who will follow him as disciples to really count the cost. And part of that was driven surely by the enormous crowds that gathered around him, especially in his year of popularity and his teaching, his preaching, his healing ministry, the feeding of the thousands on multiple occasions. I mean, he was an attraction. And then these sermons he was preaching, these parables he was telling, his teaching, as authoritative as it was, repelled the people. So it's fascinating to me that Jesus, of course, had the sense to sift through the potential motives of why people were gathering around him, to sift all that out and say, you need to count the cost, and you need to do it on the front end. All of us should do that. And the examples he gives, a person who builds a building, a king going to go out to war, and the king has a smaller army going against the king who has a larger army, and he realizes that, and he sends an emissary out, if you will, to negotiate terms of peace because it's a war he can't win. Right. Count the cost and do it up front. And so, to me, it's like Jesus is saying, all right, if you're going to sign on the dotted line, you need to know what you're committing yourself to. And then the analogy I use is an analogy that was shared with me years ago that, just sign on the dotted line, and the Lord will fill in the details. And a lot of us want the details first, have an opportunity to review those details, and then sign. It doesn't work like that. And Jesus says, you're going to be my disciple. You got to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow after me. And there are consequences to doing that, but it's so worth it. But you have to do this on the front end. I think it also means, giving up all rights to yourself. I loved what R.C. Sproul wrote about that, and I mentioned it in the sermon. He talked about, you give your life to Christ, and you experience the saving grace of God in Christ Jesus. Your life is now a throwaway life because it belongs to Him. Talking about putting it clear. And, shocking. A throwaway life. We grieve when we see someone who's so messed up their lives, like, man, they threw their lives away. And Sproul is saying, if you've signed on with Christ, you counted the cost, and you committed, and you're His disciple, it's a throwaway life because it now belongs to Him. That's great, and it's worth it. Nothing like it in this world or the world to come, but I like the expression he uses, and it made me stop and think.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. That was good, and like I said, this was a really good sermon, and I appreciate your honesty. And as we close, what are some final thoughts?
My final thought is, I wonder how I would have responded to that message that day. I kind of closed the sermon out Sunday with, if you were there that day and you heard that message, how would you have responded? Would you have done like, man, I'm out. Forget that. I can't do that. I don't want to do that. That's too much for me. Count me out. Or would you have said, where do I sign? I'll follow you. So I don't know. I mean, I'm here in the 21st century reading this sermon, and it's still, it just pierces my heart and mind and will. So I think it's a masterful sermon. Not mine, Jesus' sermon. And that we could, maybe that day gather with the crowds. And I think we'd have been fascinated by the number of people who would have said, man, I'm out. There are very few that really followed Jesus back then. We have this idea that just thousands followed Him. And when he got down to the, to the end, there are only a few. Now you know why.
That's exactly right.
It's so worth it, but if you're expecting a gravy train, easy street, all honey and no bees, you're not ready.
Yep.
You can't be His disciple. And that bothers me. That refrain echoes in my mind, and it's very confrontational. So those are my final thoughts, for better or for worse.
Those are good. So good, I don't even know if we can go to that stupid segment. They're that good. But we must, because that's what the fans want.
Yeah.
That's what our
Back by
listeners
popular demand.
So that stupid segment, John, what have we got for the listeners today?
Well, we're going to go in the direction of edgy. Ooh. So there's a popular film out called Bros. And if you do a little research on the movie, it is essentially an LGBTQ comedy. And one of the officials connected with the film was disappointed that it flopped at the box office. And one of his rationales for the movie doing so poorly, according to this person, was that straight people refused to go to the movie and see it. And my first thought was, duh, what do you expect? Nobody wants to see that. And so my first response was, what did you expect? Duh, how stupid. There's not a market for that. People, at least at this point, don't want to go down that road.
Right.
And God help us. So that's my that stupid sin. What do you think of that?
I think that's stupid.
It's stupid. It's a head scratcher. Why would you think? I mean, anyway. So they evidently lost quite a bit of money on it, and
Good.
Yeah.
I said that softly if she didn't notice.
Yeah. Good. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot we could say on that, but and by no means this is not us bashing or saying just the fact of it's stupid that someone would make a comment like that. Well, of course. Just because it doesn't do well, I mean, anyways, it is stupid.
It is stupid. And
God help this world.
Yeah, I mean, I'm telling you, if you're listening to this podcast and you're not concerned about the country and the world and the depravity that it's constantly in front of us, I'm concerned. I mean, I know you're concerned, and I trust we're all concerned, and it moves us to pray, it moves us to grieve. And I know the heart of God is grieving, but at some point, when does God say, okay, fine, you want this? I'm going to turn you over to it. And there's record of this in Scripture in Romans 1 where he gave people over to their depravity. And, I don't want us to get to that place. We may already be there, but anyway,
Scary
a lot
thought.
of stupid stuff going on in the world
That's for sure.
that seems bent on poking our God in the eye.
You're right. So stupid that it should be getting all of us on our knees and be praying and asking for forgiveness and continuing to follow the one God. And
Are you a disciple?
Yeah.
Are you a fan or a follower?
It's good.
Tough questions, man.
It is a tough question.
Thank you all for listening today.
Yes, thank y'all. And as always, to end this session, make Christ known by what you say and how you live.
Thank you all for listening, and be sure to subscribe to Upon Further Review so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions, please be sure to reach out to us at info@fieldstreet.com. Thanks for tuning in.